When the Ottoman soldiers entered Wallachia, they didn't find an army. They found a forest of corpses, 20,000 bodies impaled on wooden stakes, their faces frozen in agony. And at the center, watching calmly among the dead, sat Vlad Dracula. How does a man become a monster like that? At 11, Vlad was torn from his family and given to the Ottoman Empire as a hostage. Beaten, humiliated, forced to watch his brother's torment. He learned that mercy was weakness and fear was power. Years later, he returned home not as a prince, but as vengeance itself. Vlad the Impaler, the man who turned pain into power and horror into history. By the time Vlad III claimed his father's throne as Prince of Wallachia in 1456, his mind had been forged in the furnaces of cruelty. What emerged was not just a ruler, but an architect of terror whose methods would make hardened warriors weep and cause entire armies to retreat in horror. The boy who had been tortured became the man who perfected torture, and what he did to his enemies transcended mere execution. It became a calculated symphony of human agony that still chills historians 5 centuries later. Today we're diving deep into the documented horrors that earned Vlad his infamous nickname, Vlad the Impaler. But impalement was just one weapon in his arsenal of terror. From forcing mothers to consume their own children to creating forests of 20,000 rotting corpses, Vlad transformed warfare itself into psychological devastation. These aren't legends or folklore. These are meticulously recorded historical events that reveal how one man's childhood trauma evolved into methods of punishment so brutal they redefined the very concept of cruelty. And I need to warn you, what you're about to hear goes beyond typical historical violence. These accounts come directly from 15th century chronicles, Ottoman records, and German pamphlets that documented Vlad's reign in horrifying detail. If you think you know about medieval brutality, prepare to have your understanding completely shattered. The Boyar Massacre stands as perhaps the most calculated act of mass murder in Vlad's entire reign. Easter Sunday, 1457, the holiest day in the Christian calendar. 500 nobles gathered in the Great Hall of Targoviste Castle, believing they were attending a ceremonial audience with their prince. These boyars represented Wallachia's aristocratic ruling class, wealthy, powerful families who had influenced regional politics for generations. Vlad entered the hall and posed what seemed like an innocent question to the assembled nobility. How many princes had they witnessed during their lifetimes? The answers varied. Some claimed 7 rulers, others boasted of serving under 20 princes. A few elderly boyars proudly declared they had survived the reigns of 30 different leaders. Their responses sealed their fate. To Vlad, these numbers represented something far more sinister than longevity or political experience. Each prince mentioned meant another ruler these nobles had potentially betrayed, manipulated, or outlived for their own gain. In his twisted logic, their survival through multiple reigns proved their disloyalty, their willingness to serve whoever offered them the most power and wealth. At Vlad's signal, guards seized every single noble in that hall. Men who had arrived in their finest robes, accompanied by wives and children dressed for Easter celebration, found themselves bound and dragged into the castle courtyard. What followed was not a quick execution. It was a methodical demonstration of absolute power. 500 wooden stakes had been prepared in advance. The entire massacre had been planned with surgical precision. Every boyar was impaled alive in full view of their family members, who were then forced to watch their fathers, husbands, and sons slowly die in excruciating agony. The screams echoed through Targoviste for days as the impaled nobles took their time dying. But Vlad wasn't finished. The wives and children of the executed boyars were not spared. They too were seized and impaled alongside their patriarchs, ensuring that no surviving relatives could seek revenge or rally opposition against his rule. An entire generation of Wallachian nobility was eliminated in a single afternoon, their bodies left to rot on stakes as a permanent reminder of what happened to those who questioned Vlad's authority. The timing was deliberate. Easter Sunday represented resurrection, new life, and hope in Christian tradition. By choosing this sacred day for mass murder, Vlad sent a chilling message that he operated beyond moral boundaries, beyond religious law, and beyond human mercy. Contemporary chroniclers were horrified not just by the scale of the violence, but by its deliberate desecration of Christianity's holiest celebration. Yet even this massacre pales compared to what Vlad reserved for common criminals and social undesirables. The Banquet of the Beggars reveals a level of psychological manipulation that makes the boyar execution seem almost straightforward by comparison. Vlad announced throughout Târgoviște that he would host a great feast for the city's poor, elderly, and disabled citizens. Hundreds of beggars, crippled veterans, and impoverished families arrived at the castle, believing their prince was showing unprecedented charity. Tables were set with food and wine. The hall was decorated as if for a celebration. The invited guests ate and drank, probably the finest meal many had enjoyed in years. As the evening progressed, Vlad addressed his guests with what appeared to be genuine concern for their welfare. He asked if they were tired of their difficult lives, weary of hunger and cold, frustrated by their inability to support themselves. When they responded affirmatively, grateful for his apparent compassion, Vlad nodded sympathetically. Then he gave a signal to his guards. Every door to the hall was barred shut, windows were sealed, and fires were lit around the building's perimeter. The hall became a furnace. Hundreds of people who had come seeking charity found themselves trapped in an inferno of Vlad's design. The screams could be heard throughout the capital as men, women, and children burned alive, desperately clawing at doors that would never open. When morning came, the building was reduced to ash and charred bone. Vlad later justified this mass murder by claiming he had performed an act of mercy, ending the suffering of those too weak to survive on their own, while simultaneously solving Wallachhia's problem with beggars and vagrants. To him, burning alive hundreds of innocent people represented efficient social policy. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Vlad's character wasn't just his capacity for violence. It was his ability to find pleasure in the suffering of others. Contemporary accounts describe how he would arrange elaborate dining experiences among his victims, treating their agony as entertainment. After mass impalement sessions, Vlad would have tables set up directly among the forest of stakes, while hundreds of people writhed in slow agony around him, pierced through their bodies but still alive. Vlad would sit down for leisurely meals with members of his court. The moans and screams of the dying provided the soundtrack for his dinner conversations. Multiple chroniclers report that Vlad would dip his bread into the blood dripping from impaled victims, consuming it as if it were sauce. He would point out particularly interesting cases of suffering to his dinner guests, commenting on how long certain individuals were taking to die, or noting the creative positions he had chosen for their impalement. These dining scenes served multiple purposes beyond mere sadism. They demonstrated to his courtiers that he felt no human empathy whatsoever. They proved to enemies that resistance would result in prolonged torture rather than quick death. And they established Vlad's reputation as something beyond human, a creature capable of deriving nourishment from human suffering. The psychological impact of these performances cannot be overstated. Word spread throughout Eastern Europe of a prince who ate among the dying, who treated human agony as dinner theater. This reputation became a weapon as powerful as any army, causing entire regions to surrender rather than face the possibility of experiencing Vlad's hospitality firsthand. These theatrical displays of cruelty were merely warm-up acts for the industrial-scale torture methods Vlad developed for captured enemies. When Ottoman prisoners fell into his hands, they discovered that death would have been a mercy compared to what awaited them. Vlad had perfected techniques that stretched human suffering beyond what most people believed possible. His favorite method for Turkish captives involved a torture so methodical it resembled a medical procedure. Guards would hold prisoners down while Vlad's executioners carefully peeled the skin from their feet using razor-sharp knives. Every layer of flesh was stripped away with surgical precision until raw bone glistened through exposed muscle and sinew. The agony was indescribable, but it was only the beginning. Once the feet were completely flayed, salt was rubbed deep into the wounds. The burning sensation caused by salt on exposed flesh would have been excruciating beyond comprehension. Victims writhed and screamed as the mineral ate into their raw tissue like acid. But Vlad wasn't finished with his masterpiece of suffering. Goats were then brought into the torture chamber. These animals were deliberately starved beforehand, making them desperate for any source of nutrition. When they caught the scent of salt, they became frenzied with hunger. The rough, sandpaper-like tongues of the goats would rasp against the exposed flesh of the victim's feet, licking away the salt while simultaneously tearing at the already destroyed tissue. The psychological horror of this torture matched its physical brutality. Victims had to watch as animals literally consumed their flesh while they remained conscious and aware. The combination of searing pain, the sight of their own bodies being devoured, and the knowledge that death would come slowly created a level of mental anguish that broke even the strongest warriors. But even this elaborate torture paled compared to the cooking methods Vlad employed for special occasions. Medieval chroniclers describe a massive copper cauldron that Vlad kept in his castle specifically for executing prisoners. This wasn't simply boiling people alive. It was an engineered system designed to maximize suffering while ensuring the victim remained conscious for as long as possible. The cauldron was topped with a thick wooden cover that had a hole precisely sized for a human head. Water filled the massive pot and fires were lit underneath to bring it to a rolling boil. Prisoners were then suspended upside down with their heads thrust through the hole and submerged in the scalding water. The positioning was calculated with diabolical precision. By keeping the body outside the cauldron while only the head was submerged, victims would remain conscious longer than if their entire body had been plunged into boiling water. They could feel their scalp, face, and brain literally cooking while their bodies remained untouched. The agony was unimaginable, but death came slowly as the superheated water gradually destroyed their nervous system. Contemporary German pamphlets describe variations of this cooking method that pushed human cruelty to its absolute limits. According to these accounts, Vlad would sometimes have 300 prisoners processed in batches using multiple cauldrons. But the true horror lay not in the scale of the executions but in what he forced the surviving prisoners to do. Those who hadn't yet been killed were compelled to consume the flesh of their recently cooked comrades. Vlad's guards would carve meat from the boiled corpses and force the remaining prisoners to eat their friends, their family members, their fellow soldiers. Refusal meant immediate execution, but compliance meant psychological destruction that went beyond physical torture. The forced cannibalism served multiple purposes in Vlad's twisted psychology. It broke down the most fundamental human taboos, transforming his enemies into accomplices in their own dehumanization. It shattered military bonds between soldiers who had fought together, replacing brotherhood with the horror of having consumed each other's flesh. And it created survivors who would return to their armies carrying stories so disturbing that entire units would desert rather than risk capture. Some accounts describe Vlad forcing even more specific acts of cannibalism that targeted family relationships. Mothers were compelled to eat the flesh of their own children after watching them be roasted alive. Husbands were forced to consume the breasts of their wives after witnessing their torture and death. These acts weren't random cruelty. They were calculated strikes against the very foundation of human social bonds. The psychological warfare extended beyond individual torture sessions into massive displays designed to break enemy morale before battles even began. When Vlad learned that Sultan Mehmed II was marching toward Wallachia with an army of 90,000 soldiers, he prepared a welcome that would haunt the Ottoman Empire for generations. Vlad had been collecting corpses for months in preparation for this moment. Every Ottoman prisoner, every captured spy, every enemy diplomat who had fallen into his hands had been preserved through impalement and left to decay slowly on wooden stakes. As Mehmed's massive army approached Targoviste, they encountered something that defied human comprehension. Stretching across more than 7 acres of countryside was what contemporary chroniclers called a forest of corpses. 20,000 bodies hung rotting on wooden stakes, arranged in precise military formations that mocked the approaching Ottoman forces. The smell was overwhelming, a putrid cloud of decomposing flesh that could be detected miles away. But the visual impact was even more devastating than the stench. At the center of this grotesque display, mounted on the tallest stake, was the body of Hamza Pasha. This Ottoman official had been sent to collect tribute from Wallachia the previous year and had made the mistake of threatening Vlad with consequences if payment was refused. Now his corpse presided over the forest of the dead like a rotting king surveying his realm of bones. The stakes were arranged by height and importance, creating a hierarchy of horror that demonstrated Vlad's attention to detail, even in death. Higher-ranking Ottoman officials were mounted on taller stakes, while common soldiers occupied the lower positions. The arrangement wasn't random. It was a deliberate insult to Ottoman military structure, showing that Vlad understood their hierarchy well enough to pervert it into a monument of decay. Contemporary Greek historian Leonikos Chalkokondyles recorded the reaction of Sultan Mehmed when he witnessed this display. The man who had conquered Constantinople, who had toppled the Byzantine Empire, who was called the Conqueror throughout the Islamic world, stopped his army in its tracks. According to Chalkokondyles, Mehmed declared that it was impossible to defeat a man capable of such diabolical understanding of psychological warfare. But the forest of corpses was more than just a display. It was a strategic weapon that achieved what no army could accomplish. The sight broke the morale of Ottoman troops who had expected to face a conventional enemy. Instead, they found themselves confronting evidence of systematic cruelty that suggested their opponent operated beyond the normal rules of warfare. Soldiers began deserting in massive numbers, unwilling to risk capture by a man who would preserve their corpses as decorations for future battles. The psychological impact rippled through the entire Ottoman military structure. Commanders who had served in dozens of campaigns found themselves questioning whether victory was worth the risk of falling into Vlad's hands. The forest of 20,000 corpses became proof that defeat in Wallachia wouldn't mean honorable death in battle. It would mean becoming part of an ever-growing monument to one man's capacity for evil. The terror didn't end with mass displays of rotting flesh. Vlad had perfected intimate methods of torture that reduced individual human beings to screaming fragments of their former selves. His castle dungeons became laboratories where he experimented with the precise boundaries between life and death, discovering exactly how much suffering a human body could endure before consciousness finally fled. One technique involved the systematic removal of body parts while keeping victims alive through careful medical attention. Vlad's executioners were trained to amputate fingers, toes, hands, and feet in a specific sequence that maintained blood flow to vital organs. Between each amputation, wounds were cauterized with red-hot irons to prevent fatal bleeding. The smell of burning flesh mixed with the screams of the mutilated created an atmosphere that even hardened torturers found difficult to endure. But Vlad demanded more than simple dismemberment. He required his victims to remain conscious throughout the entire process, using techniques learned from Ottoman medical practices to keep them alert and aware. Stimulants were administered to prevent shock-induced unconsciousness. Cold water was thrown on faces that showed signs of fainting. The torture could continue for days as piece after piece of the human body was methodically removed. Contemporary Saxon chronicles describe how Vlad would sometimes preserve these amputated body parts in salt, creating grotesque collections that he displayed in his castle chambers. Visitors reported seeing rooms lined with shelves containing hundreds of preserved hands, feet, and heads arranged like trophies. The psychological impact on diplomatic envoys and foreign nobles was devastating. They returned to their home countries carrying stories of a prince who collected human anatomy like other rulers collected art. The preservation served a practical purpose beyond mere intimidation. When new prisoners arrived, they would be forced to view these collections before their own torture began. The sight of hundreds of severed body parts, each representing a fellow human being who had endured unimaginable suffering, shattered resistance before physical torture even commenced. Many prisoners reportedly lost their sanity simply from witnessing what awaited them. Vlad's understanding of human psychology extended to methods that attacked the mind as brutally as the body. He developed techniques specifically designed to force people to betray their deepest values and closest relationships. Parents were compelled to choose which of their children would die first. Spouses were forced to torture each other while Vlad observed their emotional destruction. These psychological tortures often proved more devastating than physical mutilation. One particularly cruel method involved forcing prisoners to inflict torture on their own family member. Fathers were given the choice between watching their children die slowly or personally administering the torture that would kill them quickly. Most chose to spare their loved ones prolonged agony, but the act of personally causing their death created psychological wounds that never healed. Survivors of these sessions were broken not just physically but spiritually, having been forced to violate the most fundamental human bonds. The documentation of these tortures comes from multiple independent sources, including Ottoman military records, German merchant accounts, and Hungarian diplomatic reports. The consistency across these different perspectives suggests that the stories weren't exaggerated propaganda, but accurate descriptions of systematic cruelty that defied contemporary understanding of human nature. Vlad's reputation spread far beyond the borders of Wallachia, reaching courts throughout Europe and the Islamic world. His methods became the subject of detailed study by military commanders who sought to understand how psychological warfare could be weaponized more effectively than traditional siege engines or cavalry charges. The mere mention of his name in diplomatic negotiations carried weight equivalent to threatening invasion by massive armies. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of Vlad's legacy wasn't the scale of his cruelty. It was the methodical precision with which he applied it. Every torture technique was carefully documented. Each execution method was refined through repeated practice. The suffering he inflicted wasn't the result of uncontrolled rage or momentary brutality. It was the product of systematic study and deliberate improvement. Medieval chroniclers struggled to find adequate language to describe what they witnessed in Vlad's territories. Traditional concepts of warfare, justice, and punishment seemed inadequate when confronted with industrial-scale torture that treated human suffering as a precise science. The vocabulary of cruelty itself had to expand to accommodate methods that exceeded anything previously recorded in European history. The psychological impact extended beyond immediate victims to entire populations who lived under the constant threat of experiencing Vlad's attention. Citizens of Wallachia developed a form of collective trauma that manifested in absolute obedience to authority. Crime rates plummeted not because people became more moral, but because everyone understood that even minor infractions could result in torture that lasted for weeks. Foreign merchants reported that Wallachian cities were eerily quiet, with people moving through streets in silence and avoiding eye contact with strangers. The normal sounds of medieval urban life, merchants calling their wares, children playing in squares, craftsmen working in open shops, had been replaced by an oppressive quiet that suggested entire communities living in perpetual fear. This atmosphere of terror served Vlad's political purposes by eliminating internal dissent and preventing foreign infiltration. Spies found it impossible to operate in territories where any unusual behavior could result in torture so severe that death became a welcome release. The fear was so pervasive that it functioned as an early warning system, with citizens reporting suspicious activities not out of loyalty, but from desperate attempts to avoid becoming targets themselves. The techniques Vlad developed influenced torture methods throughout Eastern Europe for centuries after his death. Ottoman records show that some of his innovations were adopted by Turkish interrogators who had witnessed their effectiveness firsthand. Hungarian military manuals included descriptions of psychological warfare tactics derived from Wallachian practices. The legacy of systematic cruelty spread like a plague through medieval military culture. Yet even as Vlad's methods were being studied and copied, few rulers possessed the psychological makeup necessary to implement them consistently. The level of detachment required to orchestrate such suffering demanded a fundamental absence of human empathy that existed in very few individuals. Most who attempted to replicate Vlad's techniques found themselves unable to maintain the emotional distance necessary for systematic torture. Contemporary accounts suggest that Vlad himself showed no signs of the psychological strain that would normally accompany such activities. Witnesses described him as calm and methodical during torture sessions, displaying the same focused attention he might give to reviewing tax records or planning military campaigns. The complete absence of emotional response to human suffering marked him as fundamentally different from normal human psychology. This emotional void extended to his personal relationships, where he displayed the same calculating cruelty that characterized his public actions. Family members, servants, and even sexual partners were subjected to the same systematic analysis of their weaknesses and potential threats to his power. Trust was impossible in an environment where affection could be weaponized and intimacy transformed into vulnerability. The documentation of Vlad's private life reveals a man who had learned to view all human relationships through the lens of power dynamics and potential betrayal. The childhood trauma that shaped his worldview had created an adult incapable of forming genuine emotional connections, seeing other people only as tools to be used or threats to be eliminated. As word of Vlad's methods spread throughout the medieval world, they began to influence not just military tactics, but the very conception of what human beings were capable of inflicting upon each other. The boundaries of cruelty had been permanently expanded, creating new categories of horror that would haunt European consciousness for generations. The boy who had been broken by Ottoman torture had grown into a man who redefined the very meaning of human suffering. The documentation becomes even more disturbing when examining how Vlad transformed execution into public theater designed to educate through terror. Unlike other medieval rulers who conducted executions swiftly to maintain order, Vlad treated each death as a carefully choreographed performance with specific messages embedded in every detail. When merchants were caught cheating customers, they hanged or weren't simply beheaded. Instead, Vlad would have them impaled in the central marketplace where their crimes had occurred, positioning the stakes so that their dying gasps would be audible to anyone conducting business nearby. The message was unmistakable. Commercial dishonesty would result in prolonged public agony that served as advertisement for Vlad's version of justice. But these marketplace executions were merely opening acts for the elaborate spectacles Vlad orchestrated when dealing with foreign diplomats who dared to show him insufficient respect. The most documented case involved envoys from the Ottoman Empire who arrived at his court wearing turbans, claiming religious obligations them from removing prevente, their headwear, in his presence. To their explanation, Vlad listened with apparent understanding, nodding sympathetically as they described their sacred customs. Then he ordered his guards to nail the turbans directly into their skulls with iron spikes, declaring that he was helping them honor their religious convictions by ensuring their headwear could never be removed. The ambassadors died slowly over several days, their turbans permanently affixed to their heads as blood seeped through the fabric. The deliberate perversion of religious observance into torture method demonstrated Vlad's sophisticated understanding of psychological warfare. By claiming to respect their customs while simultaneously destroying them through pain, he created a form of mental anguish that went beyond physical suffering. The surviving members of the diplomatic party returned to Constantinople carrying stories that would influence Ottoman policy toward Wallachia for decades. The tortured child who learned cruelty in Ottoman dungeons had evolved into something that transcended human evil, an architect of suffering whose methods still defy comprehension 5 centuries later. From the Easter massacre of 500 nobles to forests of 20,000 rotting corpses, Vlad the Impaler didn't just wage war. He weaponized terror itself, transforming psychological warfare into an art form that made even hardened conquerors retreat in horror. His legacy reminds us that the most dangerous monsters aren't born from supernatural darkness. They're forged in the furnace of human brutality, shaped by trauma until empathy dies and cruelty becomes calculation. What does it say about the human capacity for evil when one man's childhood suffering can reshape the very boundaries of what we believe possible? Remember, the real horror isn't that such monsters exist, but that they're made, not born.